Hey guys, welcome back to my workbench, and today we're going to be looking at weathering one of these Walthers Sulfur cars. And I've gotten a lot of requests from you guys wanting to see how one of these is pretty much done, and today I'm going to be jumping into this car here, which is a TGOX 1844 Sulfur tank car. This is the Walthers Proto, the 14,000 gallon cars, which are kind of hard to find these days, but I got quite a few of these, and as you saw in the last video on my Sulfur train, I've weathered up quite a few, and a lot of them had the brown and white fades done to them, and that's primarily the main bit of weathering that I do to this style of car, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how to do it. It's actually very simple. The key to weathering one of these is good paint mixture. I like to use the earth brown, and I'll generally gather the paint out and put it in the cup like that. I just kind of gather what's in the cap, even if it has some chunks in there. We'll break those down once the 70% isopropyl goes in there. For the mix, I just kind of eyeball it, but you can see there's definitely a lot more alcohol than paint here with the ratio. We want this paint to be very thin. If it's too chunky, it will splatter, and if it's too thin, it'll just run. So it's a fine balance, and the key is to just test and measure what the paint consistency is. Here you can see it still seems like it's a little thin just at first glance here. We're just kind of aiming for like a skim milk consistency. I know that's repetitive, but that really is the key. Let's get a little bit more. And the key is just mixing. I like to use a paintbrush to do this. You can, of course, if you have like an actual paint stir or some kind of like stir stick or toothpick or something like that, that'll work. But the reason I like the paintbrush to do this kind of stuff is because it really gets down in there, and also the bristles pick up any of the particles or the chunks that might be floating around in the paint. So for example, if I'm mixing this and pull it back out, it'll actually pull some little bits of debris out and things like that, so you end up with just a fine thin paint mix. So you can see the consistency. Let's zoom in here. Notice the consistency. Look at how runny that is. It seems like it's going to be too thin, but really, that's perfect. Okay, unfortunately, because of the editing software that I'm using right now, I actually lost the clip of me weathering the actual car in this video, the TGOX car. So I'm going to have to do a substitute car here, but this one is basically the exact same model. It's just a different reporting mark. I'm sorry about that, guys. Just bear with me here. But rest assured, the technique is exactly the same. I'll show myself weathering this one, and then we'll cut back to the base model. So with the particular case, we've tested the paint out. We know that it's pretty much diluted and mixed exactly how we want it. I always recommend you guys do test sprays, and you'll kind of get a feel and an idea for how much is coming out, if you need to do any kind of adjustments or anything like that. It's pretty simple with a very basic airbrush like this Pache model here. Basically, when you're weathering a tank car, you want to keep moving. So what I generally like to do is start at the bottom like this, and transitioning this color it's usually it's going to take a little bit of time, but rest assured it will get done after a few passes. And you can, of course, take as much time as you like, kind of getting the exact amount of fade or grime as you like. It's pretty simple. All you got to do is keep making passes, and you'll notice that I take the airbrush off the car. I never stop the airbrush on the model and stop spraying or start the pass over, because then all you're going to do is build up paint on the ends, and then it's going to look really unrealistic. It needs to just completely fan and feather out. So you just go over multiple passes at a time like this until you've basically gotten the fade or grime coat to where you want it to be. It's especially crucial with fade coats because you're trying to make it look like that was actually factory paint, so it needs to be as smooth as possible. Grime coat, you can get away with it being a little bit chunky here and there because grime generally has a tendency not to be, perfect, because rust is not perfect and grime is not perfect in real life, and it's going to be different in different parts of the car. But in this particular case, I'm just trying to make this relatively even, and you can see I'm just going and making multiple passes at this. If you really want to, you can take the trucks off as well. Personally here though, I'm not going to on this model because it's easier for me to be able to support and hold it up, and I don't risk, having it just laying flat on its underbody, risking damaging all that underbody piping, things like that. I try to kind of avoid. But you could set this up on some kind of stand if you really wanted to. or you could hold it the whole time as long as you have a glove, but then you got to be a little bit more careful. Notice that I'm doing the ends here. The ends generally are a lot easier to do, and I'm just going to try to kind of blend these together by going around that end shield. I might make a few passes to kind of get this built up, and I'll just kind of gauge where my paint buildup is kind of going in terms of the amount of layering I'm getting, and I'll just kind of judge and determine that. Once I'm relatively satisfied with that, you just pretty much move to the opposite side, and I'll actually start at the top and start working that fade down the opposite direction now that we're starting basically from the top, and I'll just start working it down and now blend it out this way. And then once I get back to the bottom, start working back up. Kind of redundant, but you get the idea here. You just basically keep moving and you keep layering it until you're happy with the results. So here's what all this looks like after we've gotten the grime coat on. You can see we got that really nice rust tint to the car. And I could have gone a lot heavier with this, but this is a good stopping point for the demonstration and for this particular prototype car that I'm doing. I'm pretty satisfied with it. Now, the trick with this is, again, you just keep your airbrush moving. That's all I'm going to keep saying with this. Now, if you wanted to do a whitewash fade tank car, the process is the same. You would use acrylic white or gray, and then pretty much the exact same acrylic mix in your air gun. You'd spray it on and then just build it up in layers until you're satisfied with the fade. It would be super easy at that point. But it's a good basic demonstration of how I weather these tank cars. From this point on, you can do all kinds of other stuff. But for now, we're going to dull coat this tank car, and I'm going to be using Tester's dull coat for this. And we'll just seal everything up really well with the trucks and everything on the car. I'm not removing those. We're going to dull coat and seal everything up together. Alright, so the model is dull coated and ready to go. The next thing I want to go ahead and do is add some detail effects, and I also want to add the safety tape. I'm using Western Safety reflective safety tape here. I just basically cut these yellow strips from the whole roll, and then I go back in and then cut fine thin strips with a metal straight edge, and then I basically can go in and then do the small bands and the large ones like this and any pattern I want, and then I can just transfer them to the model. So it's very, very simple. All you got to do is just kind of get a reference for the way they put the tape on there. Generally it's going to be kind of higher up on the car, but I've noticed that a lot of the older cars like these, when they first started putting DOT tape on them, they would usually put them a little bit lower on the car. So on these older models, I like to actually take the tape and apply it kind of lower on the car body like this, where you can see these bands are relatively low, just like that. And then we can take our smaller tape bands like this. We can just go in there basically like that, and then we'll start applying them in. And we'll just try to make them look kind of sloppy. I might go in, add a little bit of paint detail work to these to kind of make them look like maybe they've been chipped up a little bit, because these do get a little bit worn out after a while. They start to weather and age with the car, kind of like graffiti. And one thing I love to do is weather my safety tape. It makes them look a lot more realistic than just leaving them like this, where if you leave them unweathered, it always looks too clean and too new. Even new safety tape generally starts getting very dirty relatively quick, and you start seeing like scratches and scrapes and stuff like that on them. And it's one of those little details that if you pay attention and actually do it, it does bring a lot more authenticity to your model. So it's worth kind of weathering these up a little bit. Here you can see the pattern, how I've laid them out. This is generally the older kind of pattern. Again, they would usually have the large bands lower on the car body and then have these lower on the car body as well. Compared to how they lay them out again on more modern cars, where they're higher up like this. It's kind of an interesting variation, but for an older car like this, this pattern works perfectly. Safety stripes are applied. Now let's talk about the weathering on the safety stripes themselves real quick. You'll notice that on some of these I try to chip them up. What you do is you take a little bit of black acrylic and a fine tip brush, and you just try to make it look like some of the corners are chipping away and deteriorating off. Remember that these are an older style striping that's been on this car for many years now, and it's starting to peel and deteriorate. You got some scrapes and side swipes and things like that on this car. So this is a great way of replicating some of that age. Another way of replicating the age, and even though it's kind of hard to see on this camera and with this lighting, I've actually oranged these stripes out a little bit with some orange acrylic. And this is a great way to model older DOT striping on one of these cars. is just by taking a thin wash of orange and then brushing it over your striping once it's applied. Obviously being careful not to get any of that on the car body. It really makes these look a lot older when they start oranging out and kind of peeling off. It makes it look a lot more authentic. So this is just a few little basic steps that help to enhance the realism and overall give you an idea of age on a model like this, that this wasn't something I just took out of the box and threw some grime on. This has been on the rails for quite a few years now, matter of fact since the 90s, and it's got a lot of different elements of age to replicate that. Different stencil marks and also things like that can enhance things too. For example, patching, that's another thing that'll give yourself a little bit of realism. I don't think I've really talked about using trim film before, but a good example of something you can do is stock patching on a piece of rolling stock. In this case, this tank car. Microscale makes sets of trim film. They make black, white, your basic colors like that. They have a wide variety of actual colors that you can use, and it's just like any other decal, but the benefit of using this is that you can cut little strips and little blocks to exact size for any kind of project that you want, and you can just simply decal this compared to if you're actually doing paint patching where you'd have to do a series of masking techniques and then paint blending and everything like that. It's a little bit more work. This saves you a little bit more time, it's a little bit more simple, and this allows you to position everything exactly how you want it, and it's great for doing small little replica patch areas, which is what I'm going to do on my model tank car here. I'm just basically wanting to make this look like they modified or changed some stencils over the years. So what I'm going to do is apply some micro sol, and I'm going to wet the decal, which I've pre-cut, by the way. I'm going to load it up on my knife very carefully without tearing it, and then I'm going to transfer it to the model like this, and then position it into place. So while this thing's still on my workbench, before I seal everything in, I'm going to go ahead and actually do some weathering work to these stencils. You can see that they're pretty clean. These are older stencils, and I want to maybe make them look a little bit more weathered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a really light wash of acrylic, and I've mixed a little bit of earth brown and black together here, my two universal colors, my favorite things to use. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to rub a little paint over these numbers to just maybe make them look a little bit older, a little bit more subdued into the car side a little bit. And the fun thing with this is, of course, too, you can go over the stencils a little bit more like this and just make them look like there's some fine streaks, some little detail things like this going down the side of the car, and you can just replicate these kinds of things. And of course, once you seal all this in, you won't really be able to see those brush streaks, but you'll just see more of a pronounced streak effect. It looks like it's coming over everything. We'll hit up the old hazmat table here, just kind of streak over it like this and make it look like there's some runs coming down this thing. Hit the molten sulfur stencil, maybe the COTS block there, and just hit up that 2448 hazmat code. Just little things like that, you know, you can go into as much detail as you want. I'm just wanting to add some more highlights and really just give this car more and more age if I can. Okay, so I'm not going to dive too deep into wheels and trucks here, but I have shown this process in a couple other videos. I just use a little bit of earth brown and black, and I just go in and I hit the truck side frames at all the different angles to get everything covered like this, and I'll just work into all those little corners and areas like that to make sure that they're completely painted, and then I'll go in, blotch the paint into the areas on the front of the truck face there like that, and then I'll go back in, kind of maybe streak it up and just blend that paint out a little bit. It's pretty easy with Walthers and Athearn trucks. They usually, if you dull coat them, they paint really well. The axles are the tricky part with these cars because these are all metal, and so what you got to do is do pretty much one coat like this and then let them dry. At this point in time, you can start working on the opposite side frame like that, and then work on the other one, and then later on you can come back and add more paint to those axles because like I said, the paint coat that we first put on it is kind of thin. It's more just a base primer coat, and you can kind of see through it, so you generally want to paint them twice with any kind of metal axle is what I'm trying to say, because you can see how the paint doesn't really cover that well. Once this dries up and you go in with a second coat, it'll be completely and evenly covered, because one thing that drives me crazy with metal wheel sets, as nice as they are, is if you don't have them completely and evenly painted, you get these little shiny spots and it just drives you crazy. So you just want to be really thorough with painting them. Of course, for the wheels, I'll go into the dish with a thinner brush like this, loaded with the same paint mix. I'll paint the wheel faces inside and outside, and that'll take care of the trucks. And then I'll set these aside and we'll work on the underbody of the car. So for the underbody, especially for these mainline weathered cars, as I like to call them, I try to kind of cut a little corners. I don't go into as much detail with the underbody, but as long as I have the kick-up lines, things like that, those are the main elements of the underbody weathering that you'll see. Basically, you want to have the truck there and get a rough idea of where that pattern is going to start, and you can see that the pattern obviously is going to be right underneath that wheel. So you're going to start laying in some powder like this. I used to mostly paint this with acrylic, but then the problem was you had to sit there and try to blend the acrylic out, which you could do, but it was just a lot more work. This is a lot more of a time saver, and you get it more of a fresh, dirty, rusty color. So I lay in a bead of this grime color, which, by the way, is, if I can get the color here, Dark Earth Monroe Models. There's the number for you guys. And this powder works really great for the underbody of cars. It's a really nice flat earth tone, so it's pretty much perfect for these kinds of models. Go ahead and do the other band on the opposite side. Kind of pay attention to prototype photos, but as we discussed, this is an older car. This has not been repainted for quite a while. It's running with the original paint job, at least the ones that are still in this paint job. They haven't been repainted or repaired, so this kick-up line is pretty big by now, and it's pretty noticeable. So I want this to be a really strong color, really strong build-up. I'll go in here between the air tank, and you'll notice that I kind of, once I get that line in, I'll streak it up like this. If I can get my fucking hand out of the way. You can see I streak the powder up like that, and that replicates the runs as they run down the side of the car, because remember the center of gravity is going to be here. It starts to streak inward like that. So it's a great way to kind of replicate that. Again, go in here, recreate that kick-up line, and then pull it inward. Get a little bit up here on the saddle, because that's going to be another area where a lot of that grime concentrates. Get a little bit on this air tank here, and you can go, you know, back and forth between different brushes. You can use all kinds of different brushes for this sort of effect. Hitting up these center pipes is also a key thing. You want to have like those little hints of grime, so I've basically switched up to another flat Citadel brush, and I'm going to go in here and just very gently kind of brush in some powder, and I'm just trying to kind of get it in all those key places. These are, again, the highlighted areas that you're going to see for the most part, and you want to get these pretty well covered. Think about the outlet little hatch there at the bottom. Think of where that heat and all that's going to be. There's going to be a lot of rust kind of concentrated in that area, so kind of apply some powder there and work it out. Doesn't have to be too crazy. I went pretty heavy on this one, but again, it's an older car. Don't forget to hit up the sides of your coupler boxes too. Kind of start from the top with the powder like this and kind of work it down so you get this nice little streaking effect. As you can see here, this works really well. You can kind of get the front of the coupler box too if you like. Of course, hit up the coupler as well. Just go in there and just apply a little powder at a time until you're satisfied with it. You can even go in with a brighter rust color and hit this coupler up and get some nice highlights from that. So once I get to the end of the car, I just basically brush up all the kick-up lines and everything like that, as you can see, and just gently fan them out. I hit the coupler, the walkway, all the normal stuff like that to build up the grime, and you can see it looks really nice and realistic. You can, of course, go back in and do some splatter work with a paint flicking effect with a fine paintbrush and a metal straight edge. You could use some like browns and whites to go in there and detail that up if you like, but again, for my process of weathering for all of these cars that I'm mass producing, this is the simplified version of my weathering. Also, if you get under here, you can see I've reattached the wheels, but once you've done those kick-up lines, you can see it's a pretty effective little way of doing that trick. And I'll go in and actually hit these trucks up with a little bit of the same flat earth color as well and blend everything together, because most of the time with these kinds of tank cars, the weathering's pretty flat, and even most of it's running the same colors until you get to the actual tank body where we're getting some different elements, which I'll demonstrate next. But for the most part, it's a really nice subtle grime color combination here, and it works very effectively for these kinds of cars. So now let's have some real fun. This is a technique I like to do on a couple of these different cars, especially the older tank cars would start to get a lot of rust on the top, and it's kind of like this speckled rust effect. So what I'm actually going to do to achieve the rust is use a sponge technique, and this is something I haven't really touched on too much, but I basically use thin, firm cosmetic sponges. You can get these in bulk at any good cosmetic store, Walmart, CVS Pharmacy, any place like that. I think I got my pack from CVS Pharmacy. But you can see this sponge here is perfect for tank cars. It's also good for the sides of covered hoppers because it's a very fine sponge, but they of course also make coarser sponges you can use to do some much heavier chipping and things like that. But for this technique, this sponge will work perfect. And I use full strength burnt umber craft oil. This is water mixable oil from Winsor & Newton. You guys also should probably know that by now. I pretty much have used the same brand. I'm telling you, once you guys get used to using the same paints over, you can always unlock a vast quantity of different techniques with just using the same materials. So what I try to do with the sponge is load up the sponge like this. I'll kind of get some paint transferred to the surface of the sponge, and I want to kind of take some of that off. But you can see there's just a very fine surface of paint there. Once you get some of that off, transfer it to the side of the car and start blotching that paint on like this. And you're going to start seeing very quickly, you're going to get this rust effect where it starts to kind of build up, and it's very, very fine rust dots basically is what it is. And you can see it starts to accumulate, and as you work down the side of the car, kind of pull the paint down like this. Maybe start blending it out with the dry corner of the sponge. You can see it's starting to kind of form there. But the key with this technique is not to overdo this and not to overwork it. You gotta still have a little bit of control with this technique and just going in, and you just kind of want to just blend it out a little bit. But don't overwork it too much because you'll start losing some of the fine detail from that sponge, and it'll end up ruining the effect. I'll go ahead and switch up to the side so I can work more closely to the hatch there. And I'm just going to continue to kind of blend that out, and you can see you get that really nice fine blotchy rust. And right away this is probably inspiring a lot of you guys. And this is something too, if you want to get used to the sponge technique, how I got used to it very quickly was I just took a piece of styrene and I just basically took a sponge like this and painted a few blotchy streaks and things like that on a piece of styrene until I was relatively satisfied, and I got the hand motion down just enough to know how much pressure to use and things like that to kind of control the sponge. But you can see you can vary it up a little bit. You can go a little bit heavier, a little bit lighter, and you just can keep, you know, working that paint, but don't work it to death. Get the effect and then stop. It's kind of hard to see now because it's glossy, but in a little while when this starts to kind of set up and dry, you'll be able to see kind of the rust effect that we've been able to achieve. If there's any little areas you want to work out, you can take a little bit of thinner and a larger brush and kind of fan it out a little bit and streak it down. But I'm pretty satisfied with this here, so I'm going to leave it alone and let it kind of tack up. And just set it aside, and then I'll come back tomorrow and we can start wrapping up this car. After the paint dries, you can see the effect that we get. You can see I've done a little bit of brush blending there to kind of straighten it out. And I know the lighting is making it look kind of hard, but I've basically sponged all that oil on there, and I've maintained this nice texture to the top of the tank car. And since this is a speed weathering video, I'm not going to go into too much more detail with the top of that, but you could layer on, you know, some rust powders. You could put on a little bit more blotchy oil effects, do some rust spots if you wanted to. You could really go into as much detail, truthfully, as you want with a car like this. But again, for the sake of time, I'm showing the basic weathering I'm doing to a car like this to get it prepped, since I'm doing quite a few. Notice that the hatch area, this gray panel, I kept kind of clean. I kind of wanted it to look like maybe that had been resprayed, that anti-skid paint. So the only thing we're really going to do now is focus on some powder work and streak a little bit of rust down from this hatch, and then we're going to do some sulfur spillage, because that's going to be another key element that I like to add on to a lot of my tank cars. For simple effects on the top hatch, I like to create a little bit of heat damage, maybe a little bit of a fresher rust around that hatch. If you look at pictures of Sulfur cars after they've been loaded, generally there's usually a lot of red rust, things like that around the top of the hatch, and it'll kind of fan out. I've seen it even on some of the newer cars, and what I like to use is some like red bright rust. For example, I might use some of the light rust, something like that. I might use a different shade of rust, but it's just powder. I just go in here with a fine brush like this, and I'll just kind of go around the hatch, around that fitting like this, just to start off. And you can kind of just, from that point on, just sort of streak it out a little bit and blend it out. You can work it as much as you like. As long as you have that defined color, it works pretty well. You can see you'll just kind of just fan it out a little bit like that, just kind of blend it. You can maybe go in and, you know, you can layer on some colors if you like. I might take a little bit of dark earth and just kind of subdue that a little bit too. Maybe blend it out. So you get this really cool effect, right? Where you get this powdery, heat damaged look. And I think it looks really, really cool. It's very convincing for these kinds of tank cars. And then what we can do, if I can find the right brush, I might even take, and I might even streak some of this down the side of the car a little bit. So kind of in the area around the walkway, you can take some of that powder and maybe just have some of it kind of running down a little bit. I'll generally take the thin liner brush like this, and I'll just kind of just do some little streaky things, something like this, and just kind of replicate some more of that gradually over time, just kind of starting to streak down and get some of these little rust streaks. I mean, you can do this 100 ways. You can use different colored powders. You can do all kinds of stuff, but simplicity is the key here for this particular type of project. But you can see you get those cool little effects very, very easily with very minimal effort, and it just looks fantastic too, especially for a unit train car like this. It's fantastic. For sulfur spillage, I sometimes model this pretty heavy around the hatch, especially back in the 2000s when I first started seeing these trains. They were a lot more careless when they would load and unload these things, and you'd often see huge waves of sulfur spillage down the side. But now the excess spillage and things like that is very frowned upon in the roads in terms of hazmat chemicals and things like that. So they try to generally be a lot more careful when discharging molten sulfur onto these cars, really any chemical in general, but you still generally see some kind of spillage, and sometimes it can get pretty heavy if there are some accidents that take place. So what I'm going to do is some light sulfur spillage, and I actually use a little bit of this golden yellow because sulfur has a tendency to kind of crust up and dry into this darker yellow color. And so this color works really well. If you wanted to model a fresh sulfur, you could take a little bit of yellow, a little bit of lime green, mix that together, and you can create a really nice, perfect sulfur color that works really well for tank cars. So what I do is I use a liner brush, or a very fat, round tip brush, I should say. I've diluted a little bit of this yellow down, and if we come up to the hatch here, what I'm going to do is just a little bit of splatter. So you just go in, basically, and you can do all kinds of things. I guess I should probably adjust the camera first so we can actually see this process, because it's kind of an important thing. What you want to do is sort of aim for around the hatch, and you can kind of maybe work some of that splatter down a little bit too. And you can see with the splatter technique, any kind of splatter technique, it doesn't take much effort. Just don't go too crazy. You just want this to be a gradual effect. You can kind of work it around that hatch a little bit, and then you can kind of come down, and maybe around the ladders you have a little bit of extra splatter too. You can kind of just vary it up a little bit. Maybe just have a little right in around the hatch, something like that. You get this cool little splatter technique, and it's very effective for sulfur splatter because it looks pretty much just like that. Sometimes if I'm doing detailed like tracks of sulfur spilling down the car, I might actually brush paint it on there too. I might use a fine tip brush and just, you know, just go to town and kind of work it in a little bit. You know, you can really have fun with this as much as you want, but this is just the basic techniques, basically. And that works. Just a little bit like that. And you get this really cool effect where it's very splattered, just like that. Working all down the car. But what I wouldn't recommend you do is brush it down. Just leave it like it is. let it be this clumped splatter, because that's generally what the sulfur looks like when it spills out. I mean, if you have the bigger drops like that, you can sometimes maybe take a light brush, something like that, maybe just grab some of that paint and maybe just streak it a little bit, but just don't, you know, overdo the spots. Just leave them like they are. But it's a really... And here is the finished car now, all tied together. All the effects combined really enhanced the overall look of this model, and it's great, and it only took really a few hours to actually do one of these cars. The weathering effects I've shown you are pretty efficient if you're trying to do a large amount of these cars like I am, because in this particular case I'm basically made about almost 70 of these things if I think about it, and a lot of you guys requesting for a video like this are also kind of doing the same, trying to build their own sulfur train. So these kinds of weathering effects are great if you want to try to do a whole bunch of these cars relatively quickly and with minimal effort. But that being said, you can still go in and put in quite a bit of effort and make these look as nice as you can. But hopefully these effects inspire you guys to try some of these things out, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how quickly these kinds of techniques can come along and wrap a model like this up. I'm very satisfied with it. Just as a little further encouragement, you can see what you can accomplish if you use these techniques right. You can accomplish quite a few cars very, very quickly, and in this case I've accomplished all of these boxes worth of cars in just about 2 months using all the techniques that I've shown you in this video. So it's a great way to weather tank cars in general. Even if you're doing crude oil tank cars or something like that, another unit car of that sort, these techniques can also apply for that. But in the case of these molten sulfur cars, I definitely think it's really great. And you can of course add your own little details and other little effects to these. Really just use your imagination, use prototype photos, and you can pretty much accomplish just about anything. Alright, well that about wraps it up, guys. I appreciate you all being willing to follow me along on this little weathering tutorial here, and I thank you for taking the time to watch this. I'll have a couple more videos coming up here. The next video how-to will be covering doing some more graffiti, but with some different techniques using paint pens, so you guys can stay tuned for that. That's another big request. A lot of people have asked me about using paint pens for graffiti, so that'll be something else we'll touch on in another upcoming video. I'll have some updates coming as well, so you guys can stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.